I found your comment about the relationship between oral tradition and literature really interesting, and it causes me to think, so really, how does a professor of English approach oral tradition?
Oh, carefully. That's one of the first things that I think you've got to consider is that not all stories were meant to be told in all environments, and we try to be very cautious about not appropriating something that folks didn't imagine was going to be used in the way that we're going to go on and use it. But as it turns out, a lot of writers are absolutely borrowing from oral traditions in what it is that they're doing. And so to study that writing, we have to understand something of the cultural context. When we start looking back at that cultural context, it doesn't get any easier though, right? We turn to sources like James Mooney's work in ethnology for the Bureau of American Ethnology, some of those stories that we've got loaded up for folks to read. And we look at that and we say, man, this does not look like the story that we just heard Sequoia Guess tell, right? It doesn't sound like it. It's not engaging in the same way. Certainly I'm not there, right? I could be reading it, wherever in front of my TV versus listening to Guess tell it, around a campfire somewhere. So one of the things that we try to do in literature is to take stock of those differences in certain ways. And so we can use some tools of literary analysis to talk about that precisely to some degree, right? So narrative structure is one of the ways that we would try to make sense of that. Mooney gives us a very clear kind of Aristotelian beginning, middle, and end, right? A lot of the oral traditions that we've got don't necessarily play by those rules, right? The endings can be much more open and subject to interpretation. Another one of the differences that we see sometimes in the recorded version has to do with register or the formality of language, right? Mooney tends to use really fancy polysyllabic words, right? And Guess isn't as much interested in that. Guess is much more interested in the experience that he gives you and that you enjoy the story that he's telling. So those are some of the ways in which we would try to look at things from a literary perspective.
Yeah, one of the critiques of anthropology is that much of our work codifies oral tradition. And it changes. It's a game changer once a story that's been perpetuated for generations through performance events is then frozen on the printed page. It's just not the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. And there are increasingly folks who are embracing that change, right? And they're really kind of foregrounding it and innovating in the methods by which they're talking about these stories. Herb's video is a wonderful case in point, right? He's really slipping out of control in some ways with that animation and sort of screaming at us that things are going to adapt.
Well, I think we have a pretty good grasp of the ways in which stories are used to perpetuate history and to pass information on to a new generation. Are there other ways in which stories come into play?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely so. I think you're quite right. They can do a lot of work, and sometimes even as they might compete for authority, we can think about what it is that stories are meant to do, their function, can resolve some of those questions that might be a little bit misplaced. So, in addition to the things that you describe, some of the things that we see these stories do is fulfill a literary function, right? Or an aesthetic function, right? They're there to sort of satisfy us in many sorts of ways. And Charles Redcorn, his novel, Pipe for February, it's a fantastic example of this, right? As it's telling the story of the Osage murders, it's also talking about what role Osage traditions could have in that particular historical moment. So in that excerpt that we read, where there are some Osage cowboys riding herd, they come across some Osage traditionalists praying the sun up, right? So as you're sort of building the oral tradition in to that beautiful moment, we're fulfilling a function of inquiry at the same time, right? We're asking philosophical questions about how it is that we're going to keep on getting through our worlds. So the oral tradition can do an enormous amount, right? It's not just, as we led off with, stories about how the world got formed. It's also how we got formed.
So stories are really a powerful aspect of being human.
I think that's really well put.